So NREL is a national laboratory. We're one of 17 national laboratories. A lot of the national laboratories were created to figure out nuclear energy and basic science and, of course, nuclear weapons as well. But we're the only laboratory that was set up to understand energy efficiency and renewable energy. So we have a group of about 1,700 researchers here. The lab's been growing a lot in the last few years. We work on every source of renewable generation that's pretty much out there today. Yes, even the pilot projects of hydrokinetic and tidal energy, small wind, many things that I don't have listed up there. We have a huge group that does a lot of buildings analysis, residential, commercial, industrial work. We've got several fleets of electric vehicles on the laboratory, so a living campus, pretty inspiring place to work. If you ever get a chance to come to the world's largest net zero energy facility, come out to Golden, Colorado, and we'll tell you more about what we do, and you'll get to meet some of the great researchers on the team. And we've been imagining cleaner, bigger, modern grids for about 40 years. And I think I'm ready to say that now is the time to make it happen. This isn't the first time that we've thought about joining together the nation's natural resources. As far as I can tell, engineers and the media have been talking about it for about 95 years. And this is the first continental power system that people ever thought about. I actually printed out the articles here for you to take a look at. There's some really fantastic quotes from 1923, almost 95 years ago to the day. And what they wanted to talk about then was kind of similar to what we're talking about today. How do you take the natural resources of the day, at that time hydro and coal generation, and make the best use of those resources to enable American prosperity? And after that study in 1923, there was a variety of other studies that tried to look at the national impact of power system transmission and what can be accomplished with that. So we had the Bureau of Reclamation in 1952 that imagined a vast power system for integrating the hydro and the coal generation. Bonneville and WAPA later did studies of closing the ties between the eastern and western interconnections that we have today to figure out, was the system robust enough to handle those types of closures? And then in 2002, the Department of Energy had its national transmission study. And a lot of this work, especially the really old work, became the foundations of power systems engineering and science. We have a lot of basic principles that were cemented in the 1967 Federal Power Commission's report on the 65 and 66 blackouts. And it's weird to think about it, right? But a lot of these things are still true, right? So we were talking about long distance transmission and how that enables diversity. That was a really old concept, even in 1965. First interconnection of multiple power systems happened in 1917 up in Massachusetts. We also learned about how transmission in a big, strong network can help you use your generation resources optimally, thereby lowering the cost of electricity. And we also knew back then, why is low cost electricity important? Because it enables economic growth. There's a couple tips that came out of that Federal Power Commission article. If you haven't seen it, I'd be glad to send you the link to it if you like old history papers. But one of the things was go work with great universities like Iowa State University to try to figure out these power problems. Engage with the industry so that we can bring the smartest minds to tackle it. And don't forget to use supercomputers. So I thought that 1960 ad was great. But there's a whole section in the 1967 Blackout report that talks about the importance of computation and the shortcomings of the analysis because of our inability to model the full electrical physics of the power system. Well, I'm kind of excited to talk to you today because I think we've got the computational power to tackle a lot of these questions. But the last one's probably the most important point. Working with your neighbors. Playing nice with your friends still continues to be a very important strategy for getting the best out of the natural resources you have with the network that you have. And I'd argue that a lot of those principles were largely successful. The United States has built one of the largest power systems in the world. The Eastern Interconnection is arguably the largest. The Western Interconnection is no slouch either. It's larger than the power system in India, for example. The only thing that they didn't quite do from back then was close the ties between the Eastern and Western Interconnection. And there's a variety of reasons why we can think about why that might not have happened in the 60s and 70s. My question to you, and the question that really instigated this study, was if the value looked that good back then, what about today? What about today, where we still have a massive hydropower system in the United States, also a very tightly interconnected hydropower system with Canada, where we have a lot of trade. We still have major fossil fuel plays that continue to be a major input in our power system. We've got loads that have grown and diversified across the country, right? How big was Denver in the 1960s? It's over 1 million people today. Load is growing and changing its shape, and we still have these 4 time zones that we could be taking advantage of for balancing load and other things. But we've got these new kids on the block, right? We've got some of the world's very best wind resource in the wind belt here. That's what we've got. Of course, there's wind that blows everywhere. But when you look at the rest of the world, this is really some of the very best that there is. Then you look at the solar resource, and similarly, it's just exceptional solar resource. The problem is, it's split up. Our natural resources are broken between the eastern interconnection, the western interconnection, and the Texas interconnection. And if you look at it, the very best resource of both is in the green. And you can see that most of the best wind is on the east, most of the best solar is in the west. I'm going to argue that it's different this time. People have been talking about joining the interconnections for a long time. People have been dreaming about big power and big transmission, like I said, for 95 years. So let's talk about why it's different. Well, one, the impact of the weather is greater than it was in the past. We were always concerned about weather storms, even in the early days of the power system. But when you have generation resources that are driven by the weather, you need to think about it even more. We've got daily patterns of supply and demand in this case, right? All of your peak load concerns used to be driven by the diurnal cycle of people's business lives, right? Today, that's impacting our availability of energy as well. Finally, we need to figure out how to balance the seasons, right? Because we've got supply and demand changes on a seasonal basis as well. And if you guys can walk up to the front of the room and read some of these articles, they can talk about the challenge that we saw nearly 100 years ago and how they can still exist and grow today. Finally, we have pretty much unimaginable computational capabilities today. And what those computational capabilities allow us to do is roll back our assumptions, do the most detailed mathematics that we could possibly do on these questions. That gives us more confidence on our answers and deeper insights into the regional impacts as well. And one of the kind of really mind-blowing things is we're entering the dawn of exascale computing. And exascale, it sounds like sci-fi or something like that, but what does that mean? Exascale computing means you need Hoover Dam to run that computer because it's 1,500 megawatts of consumption. That's the scale of computing that we're starting to get into. So really exciting times. What these are going to help us do is not only understand our basic models more detailed, run full nodal understandings of the power system, but also start to understand things like uncertainty. So very exciting times that we're in. We've also got a lot of new technologies that are coming out there, right? So we've got new wind and solar generators that can not only provide energy to the power system, but as we're seeing from our researchers and other colleagues, they can contribute essential reliability services to the grid as well, up to their maximum available power. And we've got new advances in HVDC technology, which allows us to do way more than we could do with the Pacific DC intertie in 1963. And ultra-high voltage AC is also offering a lot of opportunities here. And this is the last opportunity that I want to talk about. Right now, there are 7 back-to-back ties, if you count the one in Canada that's up in between Saskatchewan and Alberta. And these facilities were all built in the 70s and 80s, and kind of like me, they're ready for retirement. And so what we've got to think about is, well, what's the best use of these resources? How has the power system changed from when they were first put in place, and what is the new opportunity that sits ahead of us? So we asked ourselves a couple questions. What can be done with these aging assets? Is there any potential value in making them bigger? This is the Virginia Smith converter station between Nebraska and Wyoming. How much bigger would you want to go on those lines? What if an HVDC network was built instead of just these back-to-back facilities which tie together? And could the rest of the network even handle a bigger interconnection? Well, before we get too far into that topic, I want to go through a couple of the top 5 quotes from the last 95 years of power systems planning, and then engage in a little conversation with you guys, because I always get nervous when people sit there being quiet in front of me. So here we go, my top 5 quotes from 95 years of power systems planning. And the first one is, I just kind of love it because you can imagine somebody reading it on the radio in 1923. But this is neither prophecy, propaganda, nor rhapsody, right? But the assured goal of scientific and economic forces at work. Similarly, in 1952, such a power system will inevitably come, right? We know that we've got these natural resources. The math makes sense, even in 1952. I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. That's what they were saying. Finally, later on, 79, almost when I was born, we started doing these initial analysis of what would happen if you closed the breakers between the east and the west. We built a lot of new generation, like they were talking in 52, built massive coal plants like Jim Bridger, and a lot of other big facilities along that time. They said, what has changed today? Could we close those connections? And they said there are massive benefits, substantial benefits associated with it. WAPA, 1994, when I was in high school, The connections are more robust than they were in the 60s and 70s. We should revisit this idea. It probably makes a lot of sense. So, before we get too far into the meat of the analysis, let's talk about a couple things that are going on. And I think Lloyd's got a microphone to ask you guys questions or let you offer your comments. But what do you think is the biggest opportunity today for transmission? Anybody? None? No big opportunities for it? Probably the renewables, I guess, is what most of you are going to say. What are the challenges you guys see to building these power systems out? No challenges? You're going to build them right away? Couple chuckles here, couple chuckles. So let's talk about some of those challenges that we see to planning. Siting, right? It's always hard to figure out where do you build these lines. Understanding the value. These things are pretty complex. Communicating that value to others in a way that they can use is really pretty hard. The thing that they taught us in kindergarten, working with our neighbors, right? Being nice to our friends and trying to figure out where our strengths and weaknesses can be complemented through the network. You guys are a quiet audience today. Harvey, glad I got you in the room, Harvey. What do you got?
With the potential of 100 gigawatts of renewable energy, which is going to be inverter-based, it might even take a new design of the inverters and where they're located, even as far as where the blades or the solar is and the rest of the grid.
Yep, I think that's a great point. These new technologies are presenting new challenges and may even create new design criteria. All right, well, how about one question from somebody other than Harvey? What do you guys think? Oh, we've got an anxious person over here. What is the biggest obstacle to realizing these dreams?
Well, one of the biggest is who pays.
Who pays? That's a great one. Ooh, getting a little feedback there. Yeah, that's right. Cost allocation, right? Beneficiary pays principles. These are really hard things that we're going to have to figure out how to negotiate. Anybody else got one? Let's hear it, Larry.
Aaron, just with respect to one of the interconnection areas, how large would the footprint be?
For an individual facility?
Yeah.
So back-to-back facilities are actually relatively small. Back-to-back, I don't know, two football fields maybe of land area. They don't take up a lot of space. When you think about HVDC lines compared to ultra-high voltage AC that would carry about the same amount of energy, HVDC has a much smaller footprint, only uses 2 conductors, has a smaller tower because of that. The converter facilities are, still several acres in size. Is that what you were looking for there?
Yeah, exactly. So the opposition that we've seen for the past 20 years on other facilities is probably not going to exist here because it's not in my backyard.
I think that's part of it, right? So some of these facilities will be smaller, and so their impact should be lower. I think that's a great point about it, and something that maybe audiences need to hear is that it's not, when we're talking about big HVDC, we're not talking about these huge towers like we do with AC. Anybody else? Let's hear it. Charlie?
I'll offer one other challenge. I think when you look at the state level and the regional level and the national level, planning needs to be done, and the motivation for that planning. But the only real driver we have there is first order 1,000, and that's only from with your neighbors, playing nice with your neighbors, and your neighbors don't even get across the internet.
Yeah, it's your neighbor's neighbors.
You got to be your neighbor's neighbor's neighbors. So the impetus to look at the problem from a national perspective, not just a state perspective or even a multi-state regional perspective, but truly from a national perspective in the fractured world of today's politics. It's very difficult to get people to look across anything more than state boundaries for what's in the national interest.
But this isn't the first time we've built large-scale transmission, right? We built it in the past. Why did we build it in the past? Anybody know why we built the Pacific DC intertie?
We built the Pacific intertie so that we could move hydroelectric power down to Southern California for exchange agreements back in the early 60s. It was proposed in 1960, and then John F. Kennedy in 1962 wrote the memo to start it going up.
And in 61, Siemens invented the technology to enable it to happen so we could have HVDC.
Right, with the mercury arc valve.
Yep, the mercury arc valve, that's right. But what else was happening? Dale mentioned that in the side. We had Russia building the longest HVDC line in the world at that time, right? So they were building a 900-mile long line. We said, well, let's build a 1,100-mile long line. And so competition, right? I'll politely call that competition. And I think that topic of national security around our energy availability, about trying to make sure that our great load centers continue to grow and prosper for American and North American prosperity is a uniting theme then, and I'm going to argue that it still holds true today.
Yes, the biggest line today.
Who has the biggest line today? It's probably China. China's
number one.
And so I've been kind of thinking about what would a transmission renaissance look like? Because I think that's what we're talking about here. You know, transmission is not a new idea. Just like the thoughts of the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, these aren't new principles, but revisiting them is what's appropriate at this time because we've got a lot of new questions. And as the transmission renaissance passes us, because I'd argue that China and other parts of Europe are already in the transmission renaissance, where they're building continental scale power systems already in China, the question is, what is the United States and North America doing in this realm? With some of the first adopters of a lot of this technology, with some of the very best wind, solar, hydro resources in the world, and some of the largest energy demand in the world per capita, what are we doing to get into this new future of power systems? Well, I think the first thing to know when you start thinking about transmission renaissance is surrounding yourself with a lot of other great minds to think through these problems and sketch things out together. And so in the SEAM study, we were very lucky to have some critical partners on this project. Jay Casperry from the Southwest Power Pool, Dale Osborne back when he was at the MISO, John Lawhorn in the back, a bunch of their staff, Harvey, Scribner, great contributors to the study. Western Area Power Administration, also a key partner. And then there's our two other research partners that really helped us make this happen and do all the math. And that's Iowa State University with a team of students led by Dr. McCallie, and then my colleagues over at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory who helped us out a lot with the data and creating some initial analysis so that we could do really robust engineering work by the end of the study. We also had a technical review committee. This was really important to our sponsors at the Department of Energy, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the two people that really were the driving force at DOE to make this happen. Charlton Clark from the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. If you don't know Charlton has been behind all of the major North American power system studies that have been done for the last 15 years. So Charlton Clark has really had the vision to do these big grid studies and ask these big questions. And if you ever get to meet him, please say hello. The other person from the Office of Electricity that's had a large role in this is Carrie Chung and provided a lot of great insight. But it was really critical to them that we engaged with stakeholders like yourself. We had 5 meetings where we had over 50 people come, and we talked about the input, the data, the assumptions, the sketches, and then finally the results, right? So we think in the modern age of peer review, it's not good enough to just write a paper, throw it over the fence, and hope that the IEEE accepts it, right? If you want to write impactful science, you need to get involved with people early on so that if you do make a misstep in your methods, you can correct it. If you do choose the wrong data or there's better data available, you use it so that your research can be top-notch. And then hopefully when you submit it to IEEE, you can actually get it approved there. One of the first things this team helped us do was design our initial scenarios. And these are the sketches that we came up with together. I didn't keep the napkin, but we did manage to transfer them into an electronic format so that we could sketch them out. And I'm going to walk through them a little bit with you now so you can get these conceptual ideas. And then later, we're going to talk about what these scenarios really were built out to look like. So design 1. Design 1 is really our base case, right? It's what our other cases are compared to. But I don't want you to think that it's a business as usual case. It's a case where we still allow large-scale build-outs of AC transmission and co-optimization of generation and transmission at the same time. The thing is, we don't allow any new power lines to cross the seam. Okay, so you can build as much transmission as you need within each interconnection, but nothing across the seam. Okay, base case, everything's compared to that. Next one, design 2A, a little bit more incremental approach. It takes the existing back-to-back ties and says, let them get bigger. Same footprint, same location, just expand the size based on the needs of the system and the formulation of the problem, which I'll talk about in more detail. Still allows lots of AC transmission here. Again, this is a conceptual drawing. You'll see the real drawings in a little bit to show the point that we're trying to make. Design 2B was a slight revision to this idea. It said you can expand the existing back-to-backs, but let's also build 3 parallel long-distance HVDC lines into the strong points of the eastern and western interconnection. Right? Instead of bridging together the edges of the eastern and western interconnection, let's leapfrog that and go to the really strong points. Finally, we've got Dale Osborne design for the macro grid overlay. And I think we've got a couple different spurs in our final design, maybe even a spur to my town of Denver down there and a couple other connectors. But this is what it started as, an idea to increase north-south and east-west transfer capability to take advantage of the diurnal, the seasonal, and the resource patterns that we have in the United States. So let's talk a little bit about our research methodology and how we tried to study these scenarios. In power systems, we have what's called a scale separation problem. Scale separation problems are computationally intractable most times. What that means is, even if you had a big enough computer, you couldn't solve that problem in the time it would take to solve it. We have concerns about decades down to milliseconds, and we care about individual devices all the way up to continental power systems. This is not a new problem. We've known it since the '67 report from the Federal Power Commission that these problems are hard. And so we broke them up traditionally into a couple different areas of classical engineering analysis. Over here on the far right, we've got the planning horizon or the expansion tool horizon, which helps you understand what gets built, when it gets built, and where it gets built in the years to decades time frame. From there, you go into the production cost environment. The production cost environment says, given the power system that I have, with all the lines and the generators, how might that power system operate under expected conditions for an entire year, right? So there you simulate the day ahead and real-time unit commitment and economic dispatch of an IOU or of an RTO. Okay, so you try to see, if I got into this future, could I actually operate it based on expected conditions? And finally, you have dynamic and steady state analysis, which is our classical contingency and stability work, most of the things that you guys took in your power systems classes. And our goal was to unite all three of these analyses at a continental scale using data, right? It wasn't going to be possible to build the super model that could answer all these questions across time and space. So you have to break it down, and you have to unite it with consistent data, because if you use inconsistent data, well, then your results aren't comparable or linkable. The other thing you want to do is increase your understanding of uncertainty by running many, many scenarios, right? That's why we do scenario analysis. We do scenario analysis because we can't survey the entire field of possibilities for the future, so you choose bookends and you try to triangulate what the truth might be out of it. And the other thing we wanted to do in this study was add some unprecedented resolution to our analysis, a resolution that people kind of couldn't even dream of in '67, and quite honestly, back in 2007, we could never think about studying 100,000 node power system models. So here's how these three tools all work together. The first one is called CGT Plan. That's the Iowa State tool. Stands for Capacity Generation and Transmission Expansion Planning Tool. It provides capital and operating costs for our optimization window, which is 2024 to 2038. And it takes those qualitative descriptions that I talked about earlier, turns them into a mathematical formulation, and then builds out the individual generators. So it says, put a couple hundred megawatts of wind here, a couple hundred megawatts of gas here, and it does that for the whole country. We then pass those results, those scenarios, down to Plexos, which is a commercial tool that we've been using for about the last 8 years, and it really offers a lot of capabilities for us to do some detailed analysis. Up until a couple of years ago, people didn't run production cost models for an entire year. They might run it for the peak week. Now with the data and the capabilities that we have, we can run really detailed models. And then my colleagues over at P&L created a PSSE model for the Eastern and Western interconnection, a joint model which has never been created before. We set that up so that we could do more analysis on in the future. Okay, the first two steps of this analysis were figure out if there's any money in the game. Okay, if it doesn't make sense from a capital and an operating cost perspective, then it doesn't make sense to do detailed contingency analysis, right? But we wanted to set that framework because our hunch was it's probably going to make sense, but we want to be prudent in how we do this analysis. So let's do those first two stages, and then we'll do the third stage if it makes a lot of sense in the future. Integrated data. This has been a key point of our study. It took a lot of time in the beginning of our work just to make sure that all these petabytes of data, yeah, that's right, petabytes, could be lined up in a way that they were consistently used. So we have very high resolution wind and solar resource data sets, some of the highest resolution that are available. It's used by almost every RTO and many utilities across the country to simulate what the future of power systems could be like. If you guys want to go look at those websites later, you can download your own data files, and we've actually expanded it to all of North America now because we're doing another study that I'll tell you guys about in a little bit. This is really important, our transmission and generation cases. This is the first time anybody's ever made a unified power system model for the Eastern and Western interconnection. We base those on NERC power flow cases that are submitted in accordance with the TOP standards and a couple FERC standards as well. So we take the nodal transmission cases that come from the WEC and from the Reliability First Corporation, and we blend those together so that we can create our models. And so they're really, what is NERC's 2024 planning model? Well, that's what we start from. Here's a little bit more information on our wind and solar data. You can see here in Iowa how we've got some really exceptional wind resource just around the corner. And I want to note that this is at 100-meter hub height. A lot of new turbines are being suggested to be at these very tall hub heights. That increases the amount of resource that's available in the country. When we went from our 80-meter hub height to our 100-meter hub height, we saw a lot more resource come out here, and actually, surprisingly, a lot of resource in the southeastern United States, something that 5 years ago we didn't even think existed. Solar resource data, again, very detailed data. We take these from NASA observations, right? We project a 1-kilometer grid cell, and so we have irradiance values for the entire country, actually Canada and Mexico as well. And our wind resource, we run numerical weather models that are significantly more complex than our power systems models, if you can believe that. So at its very core, this is a resource adequacy study. Now, I think there's enough electrical engineers in the room that they know the holy trinity of power system reliability, right? It is resource adequacy, security constrained unit commitment, and stability, right? Those are the three tenets of is my power system reliable? You have to look at it from those three angles. We really tried to understand the resource adequacy and cost angle of the study because, again, we wanted to take a measured approach. If we can't build a resource adequate system and the costs aren't reasonable, then we shouldn't go any farther. And so there's our goal at the end. If we do see that, then do a bunch more reliability and resiliency analysis as well. Everybody likes flowcharts, right? So here's our flow for our modeling, okay? Where we started from with our data sets, how we updated them, and then how they worked with one another. So we started with a couple other studies that we've done in this space, the California Low Carbon Grid Study, which was used by Governor Brown to help justify the move to 50% renewable energy standard for the state of California. Really proud of that work led by my colleague Greg Brinkman. Then we also have the Eastern Renewable Generation Integration Study, which was the first nodal simulation of the Eastern Interconnection that was done a few years ago. We updated those with a bunch of data from NERC and a couple other data sources. Those created our initial conditions for the Iowa State Capacity Expansion Model. It said, if we start in the year 2024, what do we need to build out to get to in 2038? Why did we choose 2038 instead of 2040? Because working with your neighbors requires compromise. And sometimes you can't land on those nice even days of 45 and 40. And so this is where we chose to be in the future, about 20 years from where we started. From there, Iowa State turns the crank and runs their machines so that we can get these designs that are built out. They tell us the where, the when, and the what gets built across the system. Some really cool novel methods were developed as part of this tool from Dr. McCallie. Where did he go? And there he is, lurking over in the corner. He did some really cool work in terms of transmission equivalency, especially in the Western interconnection, so that you can make zonal representations of the interconnection. In a capacity expansion model, you need to create a zonal representation of the power system because it's computationally infeasible to make a nodal representation of a power system that can be solved for 20 or 30 years into the future. It's just too much math. So they did some really great methods. I encourage you to reach out to some of the students, which may even be in the room here, and some of them even got hired to jobs at MISO and elsewhere as a result of this project. So really glad to work on one, innovative methods on really big tools, but also to have a great partner to work with as well. From there, we take those scenarios and we feed them to what's called a production cost model, and that's where my colleague Josh Novacek, who really is the savior for this whole study and did so much of the grunt work behind me, and I'm really happy that I have him to support me. He ran the production cost modeling on this work, and if he hadn't gone off to go backpacking in the Cascades, he'd be here with me today. I'm not quite sure if he planned that, though. Aaron, here's the results. I'm going backpacking. No, my phone doesn't work. So Josh Novacek, really a wonderful young researcher who's done some really pioneering work. He's probably the only person under 30 that has this detailed understanding of how the power system works. So if you ever get to meet Josh, do say hello to him. Finally, we take these production cost modeling results and we will select individual intervals where we do see some challenges in the power system to go work with our colleagues in the future at PNNL to look at the contingency impacts of some of these different cases. We didn't do that analysis here, but we set the framework for it, okay? So what is an expansion tool? I gave you some of these bullet points just a minute ago in my verbal script, but let's focus on a couple of them. Talk to you about how they're used to build the optimal power system. Does anybody know why we use optimized tools? Why we use an optimal model instead of a model that's more like today? One, we don't know how to model the investment of people today. There's so many different preferences and desires, it's hard to model the true market. Two, how do you know if your market's producing the right outcome? right? So this is why we use optimal planning, so it gives us a goal, a target, okay? Not many people believe that you're going to actually build exactly what comes out of a capacity expansion model. They're supposed to be directional and informative. They're not a crystal ball about the future, and I think that holds true for a lot of our studies. They're informative and helpful when used correctly. They're misinformative and detrimental when used incorrectly. So always be really careful with the modeling tools that people are talking about, and you have to really use it in concert with other tools to robustly answer questions about reliability, like resource adequacy. CGT plan is a linear program. It uses a zonal representation of the interconnections. We used a very novel, I think it was Crohn's reduction in the Western interconnection, Crohn's reduction. In the Western interconnection, the Eastern interconnection, we couldn't run that reduction on it because it's too big of a network. So we are very lucky to have our colleagues at MISO, James Aculo, help us do a lot of this analysis to figure out how we can make electrically equivalent zones for the largest power system in the world, the Eastern interconnection. Assuming central planning is a shortcoming and an optimal goal, okay? We know that's not exactly how the power system works, but it is still very informative to thinking about where the most value is and what direction we should be pointing. Who likes objective functions? Boy, guys, I'm a little tired this morning. I thought this was going to be the real killer of slides.
I object to the objective function.
Of course you would, Rick. Of course you would. So this is the math problem that we try to solve across the power system for each year that we solve the study. And what it does is it minimizes the cost of all of the investments in fixed O&M, variable fuel, your reserves, your operating and planning reserves, and then your environmental costs, subject to a variety of constraints that we put on the model. Okay? Does everybody kind of generally understand how these tools work, or do I need to go in more detail? I see some heads nodding and some shaking, so good. One of the other things we did is we complemented this tool with another tool that we have at the laboratory called DGen. DGen is our consumer adoption model for distributed technologies. While it makes a lot of sense to use a top-down approach when you're trying to reflect the bulk power system where you do have a variety of central actors, that approach does not work very well for understanding the adoption of distributed generation. So here we have an agent-based model with very, very high levels of resolution and some very sophisticated sampling that allows us to create individual profiles for representative people in the country, and that determines a propensity to adopt distributed solar. That rolled into the capacity expansion results, and if you want to hear more about that tool later and a new project we have to deploy it at all of the RTOs in the country, I'd be glad to talk to you about it later, but really glad that we could bring this to bear so that we can not only look at the bulk power, but also have a very informed view of what the future of distributed generation could look like under business as usual distributed generation assumptions. We analyze these 4 designs under 2 different policy futures. Right? There's a lot of uncertainty in the policy future. If you read some of these articles, you can hear about all sorts of uncertainty that they had over the last 95 years and how they're going to plan their power system. We've got uncertainty too, right? We've got the current policy trajectory, which is largely business as usual, no change to state RPS, no other big disruptions in the system. But we also wanted to look at a carbon policy, not so much because we wanted to advocate for a carbon policy. That's not what we wanted to accomplish here. But a carbon tax provides a very reasonable proxy for getting the competition between wind and solar resources that we're actually seeing happen today. Historically, the approach to looking at wind and solar on many power systems, whether it's at NREL or other labs, is you choose arbitrary numbers for your penetration levels. Let's choose 20% wind and 10% solar. Sounds great, go study it. That approach doesn't work when both technologies are equally viable, right? The competition between wind and solar that we're seeing in the United States is very rich and competitive. So a carbon tax allowed us to not predefine whether or not it was going to be dominantly wind or dominantly solar. It was going to allow those resources to compete so we get the best ones out of them. So when you think about the carbon policy, think of it as a little bit more of a proxy for trying to make sure that we understand the potential continued explosive growth of wind and solar in the United States. And here are a couple of the assumptions that really drove those scenarios. Current policy largely driven by renewable portfolio standards, and here's some details on our carbon policy tax that we used in both the expansion tool and the production cost modeling tool. Yeah, there's a lot of assumptions listed up there. Actually, the real list is like 100 rows long. But I wanted to share a couple of the really important ones about our data sources, how we made a couple of our decisions, and how many investment periods we had, and a couple of the regions that we looked at. Importantly, we only looked at new investments in gas, wind, solar, and coal. We didn't have all these other technologies in there for investment options of nuclear, offshore wind, geothermal, CSP, because we're looking at such a large continental scale. A couple gigawatts of deployment optimistically in any one of those technologies wasn't really going to change the story when we're talking about adding 600 gigawatts of new capacity to the system, right? So we really tried to focus on where the big growth is happening today. Some relatively conservative assumptions about gas prices and about load growth and other things so that we didn't go too far off the deep end on that one. Okay, so to that point, I talked about scenario creation. Now we're going to dip into the production cost modeling. Any questions so far? Okay, so production cost modeling. Go ahead.
One question on the load growth. How much electrification of the economy was assumed?
Yeah, so we did not assume a lot of electrification in the economy in this study. We've actually got 3 studies that are going on in concert, and they're going to specifically target that one. The first one is the SEAM study. That one is really trying to figure out what is the value of joining together the interconnections. The next study is called the North American Renewable Integration Study, which builds on all the data that we've created here for the SEAM study, but looks at Canada, the US, and Mexico in concert to try to figure out what the value is of all 3 of those countries working together. And finally, to get to your question, my colleague True Mai is running the Electrification's Future Study, which is going to really look at explosive growth in electricity demand because of electrification of transportation, heating and cooling, and other industries. So those 3 studies are kind of all going in parallel, and my colleague True Mai has a dueling webinar with me right now, and he's got 300 people signed up. So I'm hoping that we can do a little competition with him today and see who gets the bigger numbers. But got a lot of great work looking at that question. Of course, transportation is a major driving force for projected load growth in the United States. One of the really cool things we're seeing come out of Electrification Future Study is the potential for flexible demand, right? Outside of electric vehicles, while electric vehicles are going to drive all the load growth, the flexibility that you can get from the power system is actually driven by a couple other technologies that are seeing a lot of electrification. So stay tuned, look for True Mai's work on Electrification's Future Study, and stay tuned for the North American Renewable Integration Study as well that'll chime into a couple of those topics. Any more questions before I tell you what the heck's going on here? Okay, so this is a visualization of a production cost model that we ran in the past. Okay, this is a mashup. Right? We took 2 different studies and we smushed them together to see what the heck it would look like. And this is a conceptual image that we created right when we started off the SEAM study. Because we wanted to say, okay, let's take these models that we had in the past, let's sync them up in time and see what it looks like. Production cost models tell you the operation of the power system on an hourly, or in this case, a 5-minute basis. So that's every generator in the eastern and western interconnection, both US and Canada. And yes, we do model the Quebec interconnection as well. We don't model the Texas interconnection because its interaction with its neighbors is so limited versus Quebec, which has substantial interactions with their neighbors. And so I just wanted to show this one real quick. Don't worry, I got more cool graphics in a little bit that are actually relevant to our study, but I wanted to give you a sneak peek at what comes out of a production cost model. The hourly or 5-minute output of every single generator based on the rising sun and the changing weather conditions. So we at NREL, under Josh Novacek, conducted the production cost modeling. It simulates the unit commitment and economic dispatch. We do an approximation of a security constrained unit commitment. What that means is we don't do the full stability analysis to identify all the contingencies, but we do hold spinning reserves, we do hold regulating reserves in the study. We also constrain our transmission to N-1 contingencies that we've identified with our partners. So pretty well constrained model. Like I said, we study an entire year. It calculates the cost of producing electricity for a single year that you study, and it uses a linearized DC power flow. And we actually studied the entire country all at once in one simulation. And nobody's ever done that before, and the only reason we could do that was because of a complex algorithm that we created at the laboratory. This algorithm not only allows us to solve the problem faster, it makes it more accurate. And so if we go back, we look at this image, you can see these are kind of the planning regions that we have in the United States today. And the traditional approach is you simulate them all as one system, right? Because that was the computational solution. But that's not the white solution, right? We know that there's trade discrepancies. We know that there's separate optimizations that are run by individual regions. So what we did is we first take a simplified approach. We run a linearized DC power flow for the entire interconnection, and that gives us initial flows. It's kind of a proxy for historical transmission patterns, right? When you're going so far out into the future, trying to reflect today's transmission patterns, when we've got 30 or 50% wind and solar, it doesn't make a lot of sense to hold your model to the historical one. So you have to come up with a new proxy for flows. So that's step 1. Step 2, we break it up into how the market's actually solved today. So whether it's an IOU or an RTO, we take those initial conditions from the forecast step, Those provide our transmission flows for the Dayahead market. We run the Dayahead market for each individual entity, so PJM, for MISO, for all those different footprints. That alone cuts our solve time down significantly. When we started this, it's probably going to take us about a year to run a single year of simulations. In the Eastern Renewable Generation Integration Study, we got that down to 30 days. Using this algorithm, we've got it down to a day. So in the last 4 years, we've gone from a computationally intractable problem to one that can be solved in a day. Right? So big accomplishment there. What that allows us to do is study every single node on the transmission network, all the transmission down to 69 kV, and every single unit and every single generating station in the country. Another really cool thing, we mined EPA data in order to come up with unit-specific heat rates for all existing thermal plants in the United States. So based on archival data that we were able to download, I think there was 1% of generators that we were not able to track of thermal plants. Otherwise, we have very detailed thermal constraints. We've got a publication that's going to come out on that. I think you guys will find that really interesting. One, to see how it compares to your units, and two, maybe even to use in some of your own research where you don't have data about your neighbors.
This is the first time that NREL has done Eastern and Western within the same production cost simulation, or have you guys done this before?
So we previously separated it out. That's a good point. The Renewable Electricity Future Study was probably the first continental study of large-scale renewable transformation. Yeah, the question was, Aaron, is this the first time you've ever simulated the East and West in a single production cost model? Yes, it is the first time we've ever studied in a single model, though we have done some other national activities which ran them separately. But these were co-simulated, right, at the exact same time with interchange between them. In the past, we'd run the East in a zonal representation and the West in a zonal representation, and then we'd kind of smear it together in the middle. This is actually completely mathematically formulated together. And that was really important for our scenarios, right? Design 2A, Design 2B, and 3. You couldn't solve these models independently. Right? If you did, you were going to get some seams issues in your data sets, and that's going to ruin your results. Right? So that's why we wanted to merge these two tools together. And here's a little preview of what those results look like under our Design 1. But don't worry. I'll show it to you again, that time in full screen. We also did some steady state analysis. This was the last part of our research project where we tried to lay the framework for doing more traditional reliability analysis. So we rolled up the 2024 power flow cases. We made sure that they worked together, which was no small feat by my colleagues Yuri Makarov and Nader Saman from PNNL. They did a great job of creating this initial thing, and we're hoping that if we get some additional research dollars from the DOE or others, that we can keep building off that work and really finding out what all the various reliability and resiliency benefits are. Okay, so another pause to see if we have any questions. Do people understand the methodology, basically? We have multiple tools that we're using. Why are we using multiple tools? We're using multiple tools because there's no super tool, right? There's no one tool that does it all. There's not a Swiss Army knife thick enough to answer all of our power system questions, so we have to link them together. Any questions about the drawback?
Okay, so let's get these questions on
Yep.
the mic so everybody can.
So I'm unclear, are you including ERCOT in this or not?
ERCOT is not included in this study.
That's kind of a big deal, don't you think?
Yeah.
I'm Jim McInnes with the Michigan Utility Consumer Participation Board.
No, it's a great question. Why didn't we include Texas? It turns out budgets are tight sometimes when you're planning a big study, and sometimes you can't study at all. And so, I think that there's a lot of potential for interconnections to Texas in the future. In our North American study and in our electrification future study, Texas will be included in both of them. And, ERCOT came to every one of our TRC meetings as well, because they are keen on it. And it's kind of an artifact of not enough time and money to do it all.
Yeah, Aaron, I'd just like to add that I think there's also just some political sensitivity. So ERCOT doesn't really want to increase connections to the rest of the country because then they're concerned they're going to get under FERC jurisdiction. So I think that's a political aspect.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. That's exactly right. Fred, yeah.
Aaron, Fred Fletcher, Power from the Prairie. One of the things I was concerned about with the optimization routines that you did that goes out to 2038 is some of the results didn't end up optimally putting more wind generation in western Nebraska and western South Dakota, even though there's so much wind showed in your diagram. Why is that?
There's a lot of different reasons that the models choose which resources to build, right? It could be transmission availability that's nearby. Some of it can be skewed a little bit by our methods. You know how we did this reduction in the electric topology so that we can make the investment decisions. We think there's some work to be done in improving that into the future. And some of it's just that literally the resource is a little bit better in different areas. And some of the very sophisticated work that we've done at the laboratory actually helps us explicitly consider things like terrain, like the roughness of your terrain and what that does to the turbulence of your resource and other things. So I think, would I build an individual wind plant based on any of this? Absolutely not. Is it directional about where the good resource is? I'd say, yeah, it's pretty good from the directional perspective. Hopefully that answered your question, but let's hear it, Gary.
So Gary Sutherland, Hydro-Quebec. Similar question to the one that was asked about ERCOT. How are you modeling Canadian resources? So both hydro and wind, for that matter, because
yeah,
there's a lot of
sure.
wind up there as well.
So our hydro resources have a very sophisticated approach to, at least from our standards. We're going to improve on it in the North American study, but we are able to mine historical data from the Canadian provinces for Hydro-Quebec, Manitoba Hydro, and for BC Hydro, as well as for many of the United States systems. It's weather synchronized, meaning that we use the same weather year for our hydro data as we use for our renewables data, right? So we get those correlations matched up really nicely. So we've got some regions, we only had monthly energy that could come out of the plant. I think that was actually mostly in the southern United States. We were only able to get monthly flows, but in some places we got daily flows. And so we would enforce schedules that allowed for flexibility on that. In the North American study, we're stepping that up, I'd say, considerably through explicit collaboration with your organization and Natural Resources Canada. So we have a good representation of the hydro resources. We do not assume any new expansion or investment in Canada, major shortfall, but that's only for this study. This was the prelude to NERIS. It's a first step. In the North American study, we're going to look in a lot of detail about what the opportunities for growth are wind and hydro in Canada, as well as in Mexico. Oh, let's hear it, Larry.
Aaron, if I'm asked, or we're asked, does the absence of Texas invalidate the study? I mean, being very critical.
Yeah, no, that's totally reasonable.
But what's the response to that?
Texas is a significantly smaller power system than the Eastern and Western interconnection. So it's a full order of magnitude smaller than the Eastern interconnection, right? Eastern interconnection is a peak load of 600 or so, maybe 700 megawatts, or gigawatts rather. Texas interconnection is what, 60 to 70? I know they hit a new peak last week. I don't know if anybody knows what that number is. And the Western interconnection is around 200 gigawatts. So it's a significantly smaller system. I think in some of Dale's sketches, we absolutely thought about connecting the line into Texas, but because of the political concerns, a little bit of budgetary concerns about how much modeling could we do, we also didn't have a detailed model of Texas at the time. We have one now, but we didn't at the time. And so, timeliness, budget, political sensitivities, that's where we ended up. And then the last thing is it's not a massive system. So I don't think it impacts our answer a ton. It might actually make some of our answers look better if we did include it.
Can I add something to that before we move off of that? I think a very good answer in every way, but at the same time, if we did model ERCOT in this study, we didn't, right? But if we did, I can only imagine, because of the rich resources there, that the value of the additional interconnection between A, Texas and Eastern interconnection, and B, ERCOT and Western interconnection would only increase the overall value of the transmission designs that we studied. So I think that would tend to even make all of this more attractive. That is, of course, a speculative statement on my part, and we need to do that study.
Hi, I'm Peter Ford from Freepoint Commodities. Just a simple question. It seemed like distributed resources, particularly distributed solar, was in the assumptions. Was there distributed battery storage? And battery storage in general is a big technology question, I understand, but could significantly, it seems like, change some of the underlying
Yeah, I think that assumption is in line with what a lot of people think about what role could battery storage play in these futures. We did not study the deployment of new distributed storage. The market opportunity at a continental scale for distributed storage is not measured in gigawatts, in many gigawatts, I would say. maybe a couple gigawatts. And so that's why we decided to not look at it. We wanted to really focus down. In NERIS, we will be looking at more storage, and in EFS, we're also looking at more storage options. But we tried to isolate it. In some ways, actually, storage gets more efficient because you can use it more optimally and you can identify patterns a little bit easier, and there's more arbitrage opportunities. Oops. Sounds good.
I'm going to dovetail on two questions, the Hydro-Quebec and the last one. Is pump storage, pump hydro, any part of this?
Yeah, so all existing pump storage is modeled using some pretty sophisticated approaches to doing storage modeling at the laboratory. So we do represent all existing pump storage, but no new pump storage. And we do see changes in behavior in the pump storage across these scenarios, particularly from some of the really large ones.
Dale Osborne. Retired. The markets absorb much of the need for storage in this model. It's much lower cost to sell the stuff on the East Coast when it's peaking on the West and vice versa. And it's just a lower option than a battery.
I think that the time scale is also a big difference, right? So with continental scale transmission, you have seasonal opportunities to shift, not just the diurnal. Most storage that's getting built today is really focused on 3 hours, 4 hours of storage. When you get to very high renewable cases, 3 or 4 hours of storage isn't going to cut it because you might have a couple days where you don't have a lot of wind or solar, right? And so you need something that can do large volume for days on end and then switch directions for days on end. Right? And so there's a capacity challenge, I think, that faces storage. And I think really probably the only storage option that could kind of approach tackling this challenge are the hydropower resources in Canada and the US, and even the great hydropower resources in Mexico as well. And so optimizing this network to use the storage that we have, of course there will be battery storage. Everybody knows that that's going to grow in the future, but whether or not it grows at the scale of some of these other technologies or offers this cost savings is still a pretty open question, I would argue.
Other questions?
Yes, Jim McInnes with the Michigan UCPB. Demand response, any assumptions in that?
So again, because we're doing these 3 studies in concert, we saved the demand response questions for the electrification's future study, so we did not look at new expansion of demand response in this case. Again, there's a mix between resources that can provide flexibility on the diurnal timescale and things that can provide seasonal flexibility as well. And so while we expect that demand response and battery storage and combustion turbines or ICEs that are very fast would provide massive competition for daily flexibility needs, when you look at these big seasonal events, they're probably not going to be able to do it.
Mike Kraft from Alteg. On the financial model, is it just based on a kilowatt hour? There's a few folks in the industry that are saying kilowatt hour is dead, and there's other ways to capitalize these projects. I'm curious what that financial model looks like and what the opportunity you guys see for other value streams.
Sure. So we do represent the reserves products, right? At least the classical spinning and regulation reserve products in the model. When we go into our production cost model, we actually dynamically increase the amount of reserves we need based on the wind and solar, so we don't keep procuring the same amount of reserves that we do today. We allow that to grow. That increases the market, right, for it. So we go from a couple hundred megawatts of regulating reserve to like 1,000 megawatts in some regions, and so that does increase it. I think we hear a lot about that talk as well. About are we going to stop charging that way? And I don't think it's going to happen in the near term. But still, all the volume is in energy and capacity, right? And the ancillary service markets are shallow and saturated, meaning there's a lot of resources that can provide ancillary services when they're available and you're not during peak load conditions. Peak load is where you get all that scarcity, right? Or peak net load in these futures. But under most cases, ancillary service markets are flush with resources and prices are very low. So I'm not so optimistic that we're going to see ancillary services be the cure for everybody's financial concerns.
Beth Soholt with Wind on the Wires. Question about, so the three pillars that you mentioned, resource adequacy is the one I want to focus on for a second.
Okay.
So we work in the MISO footprint, and they're starting to think about planning for a lot more energy resources than capacity resources. How would this study change if the market rules and the planning assumptions
Awesome question. Great
change?
question. Right, so this comes down to the capacity value of wind and solar, right? How much can you depend on it? What is the availability during peak load conditions? Now, in this study, we assumed a capacity credit for our wind and solar resources. I can't remember it off the top of my head. So we assumed a relatively conservative, I believe we took those numbers from PJM's capacity market with their assumed levels. I'm going to say those are conservative numbers. The wind and solar resources that were built in this study are some of the very best in the world. Capacity factors of near 50% for wind resources in Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Wind Belt. The very, very best solar resources as well, 20-30% capacity factor as well. So we chose some very high quality resources, and we see that we can meet all the load under those conditions. I think this is a rich area for further work, and we're very fortunate that the math is relatively straightforward. It's just a bunch of math problems, and so now we've got a new tool called the probabilistic resource adequacy suite that we're going to use in our NARA study and a couple other ones that actually allow you to create robust understanding of the probabilistic availability of wind and solar resources. So PRAS is the name of that tool. It's made by my colleague Gord Stephen. And if you guys are into GitHub or coding, let me know and I'll get you guys a sample of that code so you can look at it. It's some pretty cool stuff that we have going on that tackles exactly that question of what is the capacity value of these resources and are we going to be resource adequate given the weather constraints of these. And so great question. Didn't tackle it completely in this. If we did use better capacity valuations or more robust capacity valuations, we'd probably see the value go up a little bit, maybe even a lot.
Yes, Jim McInnes with the Michigan UCTV. Demand response, any assumptions in that?
So again, because we're doing these three studies in
Yes, Jim McInnes with the Michigan UCTV. Demand response, any assumptions in that?
So again, because we're doing these three studies in
Yes, Jim McInnes with the Michigan UCTV. Demand response, any assumptions in that?
So again, because we're doing these three studies in concert, we saved the demand response questions for the electrification future study, so we did not look at new expansion of demand response in this case. Again, transmission helps you get out of that problem very efficiently. So I wouldn't say that solar should hate big transmission. I think they should probably embrace it as well.
Other questions?
Stephen, I think, has one.
Yeah. So one of the things that's come up a lot is understanding flexibility as a resource, and you kind of alluded to that just a moment ago. But I was wondering if you had any kind of takeaway results about the need for flexible capacity as opposed to just raw capacity. Is large-scale transmission enhancement going to weaken the value of flexible capacity or increase it, or?
You know, that's a great question, Stephen. It depends. Okay, there's a couple different things that happen here that make that question, that answer, an it depends answer. One, we build a lot of new flexible generation in all these scenarios, right? So natural gas is built considerably. It replaces a lot of retiring coal and gas generation with new, more flexible generation. So we do get a lot of it out of it. I think, you know, when you build this big transmission, it increases the competition on the network, right? So you have more resources vying for it. It might decrease some of the value of flexibility from individual generating units. We know that if you've got two load pockets that are separated by a transmission constraint, you can easily build a CT in that area, and that'll solve all your flexibility problems. Build that transmission line, you probably don't need to build that CT that could be the source of flexibility. So there's definitely some trade-offs. And only with stored fuels can you get that seasonal variability solutions. So I don't know if that's a great answer to your question. We didn't really focus on the flexibility topic too much because we really wanted to isolate the value of the transmission seams, and that really comes from the capacity and energy. I think you're right, Dan. I think you're right.
That's exactly what I was trying to get to. is-
Right about what? Yeah, right about what, Eric?
Go ahead, Dan. Say that again.
Here, say it in the mic. Introduce yourself, too, please, sir.
Dan Klein with Black Hills Energy. There's a challenge with how you price flexibility that hasn't really been solved and doesn't really show a lot of signs of being solved in the near term. And to the extent you can decrease the need for flexibility through a grid, a large-scale grid, it's one potential solution to that issue.
And that's a great point as well. And our model assumes that all the generators are willing to offer their full flexibility, right? And there's a lot of reasons that resources might not offer their full flexibility. So we represent minimum and maximum up for all the generators as well as their ramp rates. But those are the resource capabilities. That doesn't mean that those are fully able to be offered into the market in reality. So we suppose that they are fully offered in, but they might not actually be realized. And that's what Dan's comment is on the pricing.
So coming back around on that, I guess part of my question is, do we need to resolve the question of flexible capacity pricing? Is this a panacea for that? Or coming back around to the battery storage or just general storage in general question, is it worth investigating whether or not storage could offset the need for large-scale transmission improvements?
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot
or
of
make
different-
more optimal use of your transmission.
By the way, I'm Stephen Broad from Energy Exemplar. I was supposed to introduce myself.
No, so these are great questions and really worthy questions of I'm going to argue, follow-on analysis where we could really drive into understanding the value and the impacts of it. We want to take that first swat at saying, does this make sense in the billions of dollar range or not? If it does, we keep going. And I think that's a very reasonable direction for us to keep going to understanding these trade-offs. Because when you talk about, if you're a combined cycle plant, what's the nice thing about transmission? You can run it at a more optimal operating level more frequently because you have access to a bigger network. If you're a storage facility, what can you do? Well, you can make sure that you're fully utilizing those lines all the time, right? And so we might be able to decrease the size of those lines, but increase their load factor a little bit because of storage. So a lot of really interesting, complex trade-offs that we have here.
Another question here.
I'm going to go with the Dale's macro grid scenario. If it was a single utility monopoly, what is the business opportunity for that utility? What's the annual revenues? Is it a FERC 10% return on investment? If that's it, what's the opportunity?
This is where I put on my researcher hat and say, I don't work at the FERC anymore, and I don't know the exact answer on that. And that's why I'm hoping you guys can help me figure that out. I think there's a lot of different options, right? The traditional regulated utility route could be a very appropriate mechanism for this, especially when you have national benefits and a consistent rate of return is what you would need to get this type of financing without the volatility. So I think that's one very reasonable pathway that it could be. Could it be merchant? That would be wild, right? But we have seen massive other networks be evolved from type of merchant activities in the telecom sector. So I don't want to rule anything out yet, and I don't want to opine too much on it, because at the end of the day, I'm supposed to be a researcher, not a policy wonk, despite the political science degree.
So these questions are good. We got another one here.
Aaron, can I just add, this is Rick O'Connell with Grid Lab. I just want to add to the sort of storage and transmission discussion. I think Neris is going to give us more insight into that. But recently, MISO did a study where they looked at storage and transmission, and I think a lot of us think it's kind of an either-or question, that somehow, storage means we don't need big transmission. But that study that MISO did actually showed that storage and transmission enhance each other's value. So it's kind of an and, not
the
an either-or.
combinatorial effect, yeah. That's what we're experiencing in a lot of our other research as well.
Hi, I'm Rajiv Verma from the University of Western Ontario in Canada.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Actually, just recently a discussion came on the new inverter designs for grid integration. And actually, in this context, I wanted to mention that, and there was a discussion on the use of collaborative use of energy storage with the grid. We at the University of Western Ontario have developed a technology of using solar farm as STATCOMs in the night. We've given it the name PV STATCOMs, and actually they not only work in the night but also during the day, 24/7 basis. They can offer the same functionalities as a STATCOM. increasing transmission stability, damping subsynchronous resonance, FIDVR, and actually we did the first demonstration in the night to stabilize a critical motor, which was.
I think I remember. Did you talk about that study in Tucson?
Yes, I did.
That was awesome. That was awesome, right? Getting grid stability services from a solar plant at night. Never thought you'd say that.
Thank you. So, well, I'm not trying to promote my.
Yeah, no.
Please don't misunderstand me. But all that I want to say is that there is a tremendous amount of penetration of solar which is coming across the United States as well as in Canada and Mexico. And when we are planning grid expansion, these resources can actually, like fax devices, I mean, when they offer fax services, STATCOM services, they can actually enhance the transmission stability, the grid reliability by a tremendous manner. And I think when we are planning big expansion, these new capabilities are not just this PV STATCOM, but other technologies as well, similar grid support technologies, can really enhance the value of this study, which will make the grid more resilient and more reliable.
Yeah, I think that resilient comment and the increased reliability that you can get from those technologies is a great question and something that I'm really hopeful we can do some more of in follow-on work. All right, we actually had a rigorous discussion session for one of these blue slides. I'm really excited about that. Anybody else got something they need to say? All right, let's talk about the results. So I broke these results up into two different parts. One, we're going to talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of what are the system characteristics and how it does perform. And then, yes, I will talk about costs. All right, so there are a ton of maps in here. And I made all these maps so that you could go home and download them and look at them. And so if I had one thing that I can ask you folks to do is please download the slide deck. 2, send me an email and tell me everything that's wrong. Because what we're trying to do is get your input so that we can go to the IEEE and get a publication on this final paper in the Transactions and Power Systems. And so this is a critical step in us getting the input. We're going to go through a lot of maps here. You can see how they evolve over time. You can see where we build a bunch of network upgrades and how the wind and solar change across the system. There's a little bit of a density thing that happens here. If you look real closely, you'll see that the bins on the wind are much higher, right? 2,500 to 2,800 megawatts. So each one of those dark blue dots is very, very large plant. The solar, the scale's a little bit smaller. That's because of the distribution of wind and solar that we see in these cases. Substantially more wind gets built out than solar. We get to 7 to 10% solar and 20 to 30% wind across these scenarios based on which one you pick, and that's reflected here. So it's kind of fun to click through these and see where everything lines up, where you always build the same lines as you click through them. But I don't want to spend too much time on all these slides. Again, please go download them, let me know what you think, and give us your comments. There's a couple things that we see in there that are interesting, and a couple things where we know we need to do some improvement. But that's part of what happens when you do these big pioneering studies where nobody's kind of looked at these questions before. So here's what the installed capacity looks like across all the scenarios. I put the assumed 2024 capacity in there for reference so that you know what our starting point is. Again, that 2024 level came from the NERC power flow cases, so that's our best guess based on current projected retirements and announced additions. So you can see we've got a pretty big change in some of the resources. With wind, we go from about just shy of 100 gigawatts of wind to, nearly 500 gigawatts of wind, right? Massive number, right? On the solar front, we go from 64 gigawatts, this is what we have today in the US, to nearly 300, 200 gigawatts. You'll see that there's some trade-offs between wind and solar as you add more transmission to the system. Natural gas, it doesn't look like it grows a ton in these cases, but when you consider how much natural gas is retired, because it's literally at retirement age of 50 to 60 years old, there's quite a bit of new gas that gets built out to complement the system. We hold hydro and nuclear generation constant through our cases. We don't anticipate a lot of big changes in the United States in either of those technologies. Once you start talking about Canada and Mexico, we do anticipate some changes in the hydro generation portfolio. Finally, in coal, we do see some retirements there. I think this largely follows what we're seeing in a lot of the industry, though we admit that some of these are higher numbers than a lot of us would expect. And so there's some really interesting questions about what could happen in the public policy space regarding these topics. Okay, so a couple things that I want to go over before we dig into these a little bit more. All cases imagine a future where you can build big transmission. We don't have any case that doesn't assume a transmission renaissance. And we kind of did that on purpose, okay? We wanted to see how it compared if you built a lot of HVDC versus a lot of high voltage AC, and we do see some trade-offs in there. So even our design one includes a lot of new AC transmission that gets built. The difference is design one does not include any new HVDC, and it does not include any new transmission across the seam, okay? couple of clarifications there. The generation mix changes and moves around a lot across all the scenarios. So these things really are dependent. If you go to Dr. McCallie's lectures, he always talks to you about the importance of co-optimization of generation and transmission, and this is doubly important when you're doing big network expansions like the one that we've got here. Again, our results are known to be imperfect. These are models. These are not reality, right? But they're very informative about the direction that we could be going with this work. And all resources, all scenarios meet the same resource adequacy target of 15% planning reserve margin. You can go learn a lot more about Armando Acevedo's, and I can't remember the last part of his last name, his methodology that he used in his thesis for his PhD, where he explains a lot of the work that we did in the capacity sharing and how that all worked out. It might even be in your packets that you have, right, Jim? Great. Good, good. So please go ahead and take a look at that to really understand the methodology for how we enforce that constraint in the model. So this is how those systems operated when we did that production cost model. And if you guys might be familiar with this, how many of you have seen a graph like this before? Oh, right. People are raising their hands. You're loosening up a little bit before lunch. Okay, so let's start looking first at annual generation across our two different policy scenarios, right? So we've got the current policy, extends existing RPS. We've got the carbon policy, which is a proxy for continued growth in renewable energy. You can see a couple things, maybe, at least to me, jump out rather quickly. We can see the size of these blocks change quite a bit across the scenarios, right? So the blue, which is the wind, grows considerably across all cases as you add big transmission. That's because it's nominally the cheapest source of new generating technology across the country. We see it when you add the carbon policy case, of course, you're going to see a lot of reduction in the largest carbon emitter energy source. So we expected that to see happen. And we do see some, when you look at this scale, remember this is 5,000 terawatt hours, right? I don't know how to put that into more perspective than to say it's terawatt hours and it's a lot of them. Okay, so we're talking about large amounts of energy. And so when you look at it at a continental scale like this, or eastern and western scale, it's really hard to tell how are these different, right? They don't look any different from here, right? But when you dig down into the regional results, you can see that it moved in the power system. And while your capacity amounts nominally stay the same, or your generation amounts, it really moves across the country based on where you build those connections and the scenario that you're looking at. Here's some interesting information about the percent of total generation, right? So when we add all the generation up, what percent of it comes from different classes of resources. We've got fossil fuels that are providing between 30 and 25% of our energy in these cases. Wind and solar are about the same almost, from 28 to 39%. And then the last one, which I think is kind of intriguing, is the amount of carbon-free energy in these cases. When you add up the nuclear, when you add up all the biofuels, the geothermal, the wind, the solar, we get to 60, 70% carbon-free energy. It's a big number. It's almost as big as Canada's numbers for carbon-free energy, right? So that big future that a lot of people think about isn't so far away if you're looking at the carbon-free problem. Generation differences. Remember how I told you those last plots that we looked at didn't have a lot of change? Well, these are a diff plot. Diff plot is what the real analysts call. I want to point out an artifact here. You can see that the nuclear changed here. That's because of our outage scheduling in our tool. It just so happened that the nukes went out on forced outage randomly through our simulation. So that's where that change came from. The rest of the changes are real, we have confirmed. So in the current policy case, you see a decrease in your coal, in your CTs, and your solar compared to design 1. Does that make sense how this diff chart works? Over here you would have design 1. There'd be no change because that's what you're comparing against. You're subtracting from there. So you see decreases in these technologies and increases in these technologies, okay? Massive, dominated by increased use of wind. And you see the hydro generation actually gets used more efficiently as well across these scenarios, okay? Go over here, the story continues, right? We see substantial decrease in coal, slight decreases in CC, some substantial decreases in your combustion turbines, and a big increase in the wind and combined cycle plants. Regional generation. This is where there were a lot of changes. And we looked at 16 regions. I might be getting those graphs out in another file to people later, but these were the ones that saw some really substantial change across it. One of the things I do want to point out is this red bar. Those are called curtailment. Right? Curtailment is when you have available renewable generation, but not enough load or transmission capacity to get it out of your network, right, or to get it to the loads. We do see some sizable amounts of curtailment in this study. That indicates that either we're hitting minimum generation levels, or we've got transmission congestion, or something else. We've got a coincidence problem where it's just simply too much supply. We've investigated that a little bit. It's really hard to figure out what is driving curtailment, but it looks like it's transmission congestion that is driving the curtailment in a lot of these cases. That is partially an artifact of our method for assuming capacity credit for our resources, right? We assumed very low capacity credits for our wind and solar resources in the expansion model. Therefore, we didn't see a lot of curtailment. When you go to this high-res model, where you model every single other plant, you have to curtail more, right? The model was only built for so much, right? The minimum capacity value of those resources. So after this work, you'd probably want to say, God, we could probably increase the size of some of that transmission potentially considerably to get more of that renewable energy out. Conversely, you could also argue that this slightly overestimates the value of some of these overlays or some of these builds, okay? But this is where there's room for more robust research to try to figure that out. Directionally, the results still look really good. You kind of can't make it out in these other graphs. This is the load. The area underneath that dotted line are the imports, and this is their local generation. And I want to point out for MISO and SPP here, their load's down here, right? So they're massive exporters. Same with MISO, Mountain West Transmission Group, as we'll see in this case, when we do with a carbon policy, they start exporting a lot more, okay? And we see energy where it's built changing across these scenarios. So in our design one, we build a fair amount of solar in both interconnections and a little bit of wind in both interconnections. As we increase the connectivity of the two interconnections, we actually see that changing. We see wind moving to the east, where the most exceptional resource is in the eastern interconnection, and we see the solar resources moving towards the desert. And you can see that. I wish the other one that I put up here was West Connect, because West Connect builds a massive amount of solar to export to the rest of the interconnections. Turns out being in the desert's a good place for solar. So a lot of good results here, and again, you can see how much this scale changed, right? So the scales change here for SPP. It goes from up to 600 up there to 1,000. Right, so scales do change. It's appropriate to change your scales sometimes in graph when you got to make a point like this, but there's a massive amount of deployment of wind and solar resources in these regions. And yeah, if you look at this, they're probably functioning for most hours very close to 100% renewable energy. Right, kind of a big idea, totally different world. Of course, they're going to have to import from their neighbors when there's not a lot of wind available, but this is a bold new world that we're seeing, right? 30 to 40% on a continent or eastern and western basis means some regions are going to be hitting kind of never imagined before penetration levels in order to accomplish that. So a lot of new questions kind of come out from that. Here's a little bit more on our curtailment. These are big numbers, right? 15 to 13% curtailment indicates that there was something going on where we're not getting the full use out of these resources. It's not quite clear if it's only during the solar peak or only during the windiest periods, but that's an area for more research. It could decrease the value of it, except we've seen in some instances where modest increases in the transmission can take big chunks out of their curtailment. So definitely want to dig into that question a little bit more. You know, like I said, first real time anybody's done an analysis at this scale, so you better find a couple woolly bullies in there, otherwise you didn't do your job good enough. Here are some nice dispatch stacks for people that really enjoy those. I showed these to my dad earlier, and he's like, what the heck is that? He is not a power systems guy or a political science major like me. But there's a couple different things, and I'm going to flip back and forth through these so we can see what happens. So this is a period where we have very high VG in both cases, variable generation. And the high carbon case, you can see that the coal is effectively gone from the dispatch stack there. And you can see how these are your duck curves, right? At a continental scale. And so we see how that changes, and here's what that looks like in operations. So this is a visualization that we created at the laboratory called Kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope was designed to help us answer a couple different things. One, we wanted a validation tool. You know, when you've got many, many gigabytes of solution files, it's really hard to understand where there's some errors or where there's some faults. So one, this is a tool for validating results. Two, it's a tool for helping us understand what it means to coordinate with your neighbors. Right? What does it mean to trade with your neighbors? It's very easy to understand how Tarvi and I could trade together, but if I'm going to trade with 15 or 20 different people, it's pretty much a mess to figure that all out. So we've got a couple different visualization components here, and I'll walk through them now. Along the bottom of the slide, we have the aggregate flows across the seam between the interconnections. So that is the sum of all trade between each zone. Okay? If it's blue, that means the western interconnection is exporting. If it's pink, that means the eastern interconnection is exporting to the west. The chord diagram up here, this is a pretty tough one to look at, but it's very helpful in the laboratory when you can hit pause and look to see where the systems are interconnecting and where the energy is flowing. This shows how flows go between systems. So we've got the eastern interconnection here and the western interconnection here. You can see flows within the interconnection, right, between neighbors in the east, and then you've got the flows across the western interconnection. They're red at this point because for the most part they're flowing to the west, but you can see a couple of them that are blue because it's flowing towards the east. Okay? All right, now let's go to the big one in the middle. In the middle, we have every single generator that's modeled in this study at its operating point for every hour. We did not do 5-minute analysis in this study, though we could have. The reason we didn't is because we didn't see a lot of changes when you go down to the 5-minute analysis. I mean, it's important to prove that you don't see a lot of change there. Of course, there's the variability of the load, but it wasn't ever really a problem in our prior research, and so we've looked at that quite a lot, and we wanted to focus on the hourly things here, and we knew we had such a big problem that seemed like an appropriate thing to do. So each dot is an individual generating technology. You can see the color coding here, as well as the scales for the different, for the generators and for the transmission lines. The entire AC network underneath this, all 100,000 nodes, are fully represented in the model. Okay, so we do represent them, but for clarity, we couldn't show all those lines because that would have really looked like a scramble. But we've got here projected is the macro grid overlay. And we can see here how this design helps us get through an event. And this event here is low net load. We've got very low load conditions and very high levels of renewable generation. This is part of this is caused by, oh, look at that. I got 2 of them now. So there's the sun passing. You can see the solar generation come up. And because of the load conditions, you have a lot of the generation coming out of the eastern interconnection and serving the western interconnection during those intervals. And so when you start thinking about what is the value to this, right? Well, of course you can get through seasonal problems and diurnal problems that we've talked about. But you can also get through some extreme events a little bit more easily, right? Extreme events where you can use the entire power of the eastern interconnection to help balance the whole western interconnection, right? Because of the scale differences, right? And what you'll see at sunset, those little blue bobs up, that's exporting solar, right? From California and West Connect to help serve peak load in the eastern interconnection, even during these low load conditions, right? So we do see these working together even under current policy assumptions. Now here's under the carbon policy case with our design 2A, and here I really want to drive home a point. People ask me, oh, Aaron, what's the winner? Is it design 2A? Is it design 2B? Which one are you going to bet on for the future? And I go, I don't know. I don't know which one's best because we see the same patterns emerging from a lot of these tools, which to me suggests that the appetite for building these is what the constraint is, right? So if we have the appetite to build, up to 20 gigawatts of transfer capability along the existing seam, we can take advantage of these diurnal cycles. Export the sun from the west, export the wind from the east based on its availability and reach our mutual goals. I want you to pay attention here to this graph. When you see a lot of the importing, and imagine how much of that energy could be traded to help the western interconnection reach its very aggressive renewable energy goals in California and the other states, right? If you had a sink to the eastern interconnection to the world-class wind, think about how much easier it would be to reach those targets. Easier meaning more economic to meet the same reliability standards. And so I just wanted to show the range of the results here, right? Macro grid is a really cool dream. We've been talking about it for a long time. The feasibility is a very good open question. But we still do have these existing resources that could be changed today and also provide substantial national benefit. And that's why we need the dialogue. We need the dialogue to see which one of these back-to-backs do we want to upgrade? Which components of the macro grid, whether all of it or some of it, do we want to build out so that we can try to realize these values in the future? So these videos should all be up on YouTube now, I think. I think they actually just got uploaded. My phone's been vibrating, which I think is my communications person telling me it's online. So I've got a website towards the end where you guys could go look at our SEAMS results, hopefully download the slide deck. I think that's up there by now, though the slide deck's 400 megabytes because of all these videos, so be patient as you download it. But then you can go to the YouTube channel and check out these videos and hit pause and maybe even pinch to zoom a little bit so you can see the regional differences. Oops, looks like I broke my, okay, so a couple takeaways, okay? We've got a little bit differentiation from takeaways, caveats, and findings, okay? I know you guys can all read. A couple points to point out. That we really show that this power system is reliable from a resource adequacy perspective. While the CGT plan, the Iowa State tool, gives us a good probabilistic understanding of the availability of resources, when we do that production cost modeling, we show that all load and all reserves are met for all 8760 hours that we studied. Now, the more robust thing to do would be to do multiple weather years of analysis, and we're going to do that in future work. It's just to do multiple years of analysis, it takes multiples of time to solve that problem, and we wanted to get this out. So we ran 1 year of weather analysis. That's more than most people do. In the next couple months, we're going to run 7 years of weather analysis. Again, we approximate the N-1 contingency, so I would say that this is a security-constrained unit commitment in this case. So we've really hit two of those big thrusts of reliability on the one end of the reliability spectrum. This is an important one. Increased transmission results in increased opportunities for expanded and efficient generation, right? As you increase the size of the network, there's more other groups to match with and to bid and compete with. Lastly, we see that the theory that if you build big cross-country transmission, you're going to get a lot of energy and capacity sharing. We see that play out in the videos that I just showed you, right? We see diurnal patterns, right, where you trade day in and day out to manage those. We also can see some extreme event management that happens as well. Okay, so let's talk about what it could cost and what some of those benefits might be associated with it. So this is a big table. I wanted to give you a big table so you could actually see what was buried in there. I mean, I could have just kept it to the benefit to cost ratios in that bottom row, but I wanted you to see how all the math worked out. And we've got a little bit of color coding here. Sorry, Jim, I changed it from blue and orange to green and orange. A little bit of a change for you. So let's go ahead and walk through this. So we've got a couple different columns here, and guys, if you have questions, just stop me and ask. We've got D1, D2, and then the delta. Delta is the change between these two cases. So in this first row, this is our total transmission line investment. So we spend between Design 1 and Design 2A an extra $3 billion of investment. These are the other costs associated with that system, so your generation investment, your fuel costs, your variables. Since we don't have a carbon cost in this case, we don't include it there, and your reserves. And then you get your total non-transmission costs, right? So that's your cost from this scenario to this scenario. Whoops. From this to this go down $4 billion. That makes the benefit to cost ratio 1.26 for our most modest expansion. 1.26 is just about what you need to get through FERC's benefit to cost ratio requirements for building new transmission, okay? So even under current policy considerations in our most conservative case, this still looks like a decent idea to increase the size of the existing back-to-backs. As we move across our scenarios, we see that benefit to cost ratio change. Okay, it doesn't say super high in the current policy cases, but they still do pay for themselves. And then when we go to the carbon policy case, you see substantial growth. Okay, this is just for the 15-year optimization window, right? So we own, for the 15 years from 2024 to 2038, you pay for that asset, in this case, 2.4 times over in 15 years. In a minute, I'm going to talk to you about the going forward benefits from these scenarios, right? So it's not just the savings that you get in that window, but also through the lifetime of the asset, right? So does everybody understand how this table works? And they see that we have benefit cost ratios 2, 3.3, and 2.52 across our cases. A lot of those savings come from decreases in generator investment costs. You use more efficient and your highest quality resources as you build more transmission. We also see more optimal use of those resources and lower variable and fixed costs. Okay, in the carbon case, the more transmission you add, the lower the cost of compliance with the carbon constraint. These are the production cost values, right? So when we ran our 1 year of hourly simulations to reflect an actual hour of operations on the power system, we see another couple $2 billion of savings per year, right? So that means in the year 2038, you keep that system constant. In Design 2A, you're going to save $3.5 billion on top of what you already recovered in the first few years. Now, as long as that system stays the same going into the future, you're going to keep saving that amount of money. Now, this becomes a really complex math problem. You start mixing value streams really quickly. But these assets could be 35 years old, or if they're like their aunts and uncles, they could be 60 or 70 years old. And you keep compounding that value over time, right? If we're talking about investments for future generations, that's a pretty big savings account to give to people going forward as they're, well, my kids will be entering college, I think, by about 2038. So lots of enduring value from these cases across all designs. That suggests that there's multiple approaches that could be enabled by policy and societal benefits that could realize these futures. So it doesn't have to be these lines exactly. It could be lines akin to it. It could be mixes and mashes of it. But I think the message is very, very clear here. Across all scenarios, and we didn't expect this when we first started the study, we see large-scale investments and large-scale benefits associated with these futures. Here's my summary benefit to cost ratio slide. All designs produce benefits that exceed the costs. The results should be reviewed directionally, not prescriptively. That just doesn't mean you should go build a 9-gigawatt plant in Nebraska for a back-to-back facility immediately today, but maybe you should make it somewhat bigger if you're going to be replacing it in the near term, maybe a lot bigger, maybe an order of magnitude larger. Full asset life for these resources is expected to be 35 years, so the benefits could be significantly higher. Also, remember, these are all compared to our design 1, where you could build lots of HVAC. If we compared it to today, where we can't build a lot of HVAC, these benefits probably go up considerably, right? They might even double, right? So that's one of the cases we'd really love to run in the near future is what happens if we didn't enable any new interregional transmission, and how does that compare to these cases? I think the number's going to go up quite a lot. Last point, it is not appropriate to assume that these savings perpetuate for the whole lifetime of the asset. You can't multiply this by 20 and get the lifetime value of that asset because the power system continues to evolve. And so that number could go up or it could go down. My hypothesis is that if you get a lot more electrification or you get a lot more load growth or a lot more renewables, these values are going to continue to grow. Now, if you don't get a lot of it, we think we've seen a little bit of a lower bound on that by doing our current policy case. And so the value still looks to be pretty significant. There's a couple areas of refinement. Whenever you're doing research like this, you find some holes, you find some barriers, and we didn't want to hide behind any of those. We know that we've got a couple things that we'd like to improve on, and so here's a little bit of a list of them. We haven't run multi-model analysis like this before at this scale. There's some seams between your models. We did a lot of work upstream to make sure our data was consistent going into them. The translation from those zonal models to the nodal models is really tricky business, maybe even a little bit of room for new science in that space. So that's an area where we've got to do some more work. Again, we want to study more scenarios. We want to look at that no new transmission case. We also want to look at an idea of synchronizing both the interconnections like they talked about in the 70s and the 90s. In Design 2B and Design 2A, you build an awful lot of AC transmission just to get to those back-to-back bottlenecks, right? And so the question comes, well, why put a back-to-back there? Why not just use HVAC to go across the seam? Why not have one large interconnected power system? So it's a really great question. Another one, we want to analyze multiple weather years because we've got such a high level of weather-dependent resources. It really behooves us to understand what the different weather patterns could be. If you had infinite money, you would run climatological models to project how that could look out into the future, but you'd also need infinite compute time to go along with that infinite money. And so for the near term, all we have is historical weather data. Then also, we'd really like to understand that final aspect of the reliability problem, which involves more rigorous contingency analysis than we did in this study, and also some stability analysis to understand the frequency response of the system and the ability to recover. These topics really overlap in a lot of ways with resiliency. And so to what extent can these systems help us understand the ability to get out of high impact, low probability events like extreme storms or attacks or portfolio risks that you might have out there on the network. So a lot of room for future work. Okay, so the 4 findings. It's always tough to get these down to bites that people can actually consume and take home and that you can be fairly confident at. And so the first one that we are really pretty darn confident about is that there is significant value to increasing the transfer capability across the country and to eliminating the seam between the eastern and western interconnection. Today that seam is about 1,300 megawatts, joins together several hundred gigawatt power systems, right? Those systems were right for the system that we had at the time, but they don't look like they're right for the system that we have that we're probably going to get into the future. The cross-seam transmission and how much you add has a significant impact on the location of the wind and solar resources. As you increase transfer capability, you build out more of your best-in-class resource. So you build more of the best solar in the west and more of the best wind in the east as you increase that transfer capability. The cross-seam transmission really proves our hypothesis going into it, is that you do get substantial energy and operating reserve benefits across all these cases. And we see that in the visualizations where you see daily trading patterns, and also you see some seasonal patterns and some extreme event patterns as well. Lastly, this is not conclusive of all the benefits and all the costs associated with this case. There's a bunch of other analysis that we could be doing, as I mentioned before, the frequency response and the resilience to extreme events that could considerably increase the value of these capabilities. Other things that we're going to do as part of the North American study is look at expanding some of these scenarios into Canada through additional legs of the macrogrid or additional expansion of the back-to-back ties in Canada as well, and increase connections with Mexico, which we have weak connections with today. So a lot of room for new work in that space, and a couple projects that are going to take away a couple little chunks on it. Okay, so before we get into those questions, I see the hands going up. Everybody knows what they have to go do after this? Go download the slide deck. 2, write me your comments and tell me what I did wrong or right today so that we can get them into our IEEE paper. And then our goal is to try to get this submitted in the next 3 months. The peer review process is always a bear, but it's also the way that you know that you have a good report at the end of the day. We thought a lot about just putting this out as an NREL technical report. We thought we had a lot of the peer review through our TRC, through engagements with ESIG and coming here today, but we really want that final seal of approval. So please, give us your comment. These are not the final results. We're not going to do any more modeling runs, but if we need to caveat this or couch it correctly, or there's insights that we haven't captured yet, please let me know. And with that, let's go to the questions. Larry?
I'll ask you questions that torment me, and I can't answer them. Gina McCarthy, a couple of months ago, said that the biggest mistake she made on the Clean Power Plan rule was to put carbon reduction at the top of the list and put health effects and benefits at the bottom. And she said, if I had it to do all over again, it would have been the opposite. And looking at all of this extraordinarily good work, it looks like there's one thing that's missing, is health effects.
Yeah.
And it's all carbon. And I work in an environment in which some people don't believe in carbon, but the same people are very concerned about health effects. So this is kind of a cautionary tale.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's an absolutely appropriate question to ask. In the Los Angeles 100% renewable energy study that I'm doing with LEDWP, we are explicitly going to tackle that question, albeit on a much smaller scale. We want to look at not only the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the particulate and air quality impacts of this transformation, because that's where you might see a lot of big changes that actually impact whether or not your child has asthma or other problems that are associated with poor air quality. So I think it's a great point. I'd love to do more on it. Traditionally, we have not been funded to do that type of research in the past. And so they've really just focused on our electrical engineering work. But you're absolutely appropriate to count that.
Question here.
Oh.
Sorry. So when we look at investment in large-scale transmission in the East Coast, there's a lot of debate about, do I invest in transmission on the electrical side or do I invest in transmission on the natural gas side? And so my question to you, when I think about sort of the east-west connection, and we see a lot of natural gas growth coming out of Texas, coming out of Marcellus, coming out of Utica, have you looked at all at the natural gas transmission system dynamically, or is that sort of static in your overall analysis?
So that is static in our overall analysis. However, we have a variety of projects at the laboratory, and my colleague Doug Aaron can tell you more about that work through the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis at the laboratory, where we're doing a lot of coordinated natural gas and electricity system analysis. So I don't have a perfect answer for you. There are no continental scale models or data sets even to do natural gas analysis at this scale. So right now, we've only been able to do localized analysis where people are willing to give us the data. But if you wanted to make, even just a Western interconnection natural gas model, well, maybe Stephen has something for you, but we understand it's been a very, very big challenge to get the data to feed into those.
So your discussion of the no new transmission area for improvement really kind of triggered a thought for me. And do you plan on attempting anything in that vein? And the reason I ask is, something of this magnitude requires some sort of policy direction in order to address a policy issue like that. Kind of have to have that linkage back to what happens if you don't do anything. I think the hypothesis there obviously is probably you install a ton more generation resources, more localized.
Yep.
Your curtailments shoot through the roof. Obviously generation is typically a lot more expensive than transmission.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Dan, and I would love to do that work. We got to figure out how to get DOE or somebody from industry to fund it. So if I have another action item, if you know anybody at DOE, particularly the Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium, go ahead and write a letter or make a phone call to Kevin Lynn or Charlton Clark or Bruce Walker, if you know him, and talk about the importance of these capabilities for understanding North American resiliency and economic competitiveness. Because I think we want to do that study. We have all the capabilities sitting over at the laboratories to do more analysis, but we only had 18 months to do this work. And so, so yeah, there's more to do. And if you guys want to talk more about what we could do next, well, there's my email address. Glad to talk about it.
This is Stephen Broad from Energy Exemplar. In regards to the gas modeling question and understanding gas constraints, we do have data sets that operate on the continental level.
Oh, great.
And in fact, our Plexus tool is able to do gas-electric co-optimization for the power system side. So that's something to consider if you're interested in that type of work. The national level gas models that we have are rather aggregated by comparison to an ordinary gas model. But
Sweet.
for a macro scale type of problem like this, just trying to figure out what kind of gas constraints might arise, I think it would be more than adequate.
Oh, yeah, I think that would be a really great follow-on analysis onto this, because it helps you understand a little bit of the trade-offs more. Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, hi, Rob Gramlich with Strategies. You had resilience as one of your benefits. I wanted to get you to talk about that a little bit more, since it's what the chairman of FERC has said is their top issue, and Department of Energy has said so as well. And specifically, since that term is not very well defined anywhere, if there were something to happen to a set of generators in one region, what have you learned from this study about how this grid could help?
Yeah, no, great question. I think we've learned that large-scale transmission across all of our scenarios enables reconfiguration, right? So you can get out of a bunch of different binds in a bunch of different cases. So we ran a whole bunch of weather conditions for 2012, and we see a lot of patterns like this, where you have your daily normal conditions patterns, and then you have disturbances like this. This is a weather disturbance. This is not normal. This is a tail event. This is the most extreme period. And you see the assets are used differently in order to balance that period. Now, we haven't gone in and done a Superstorm Sandy analysis. Actually, I think Superstorm Sandy is in this case, but we never dug into it in a lot of detail. But you can see how these assets can be used to redirect the power if there's no availability in a place. And at the scale of 30 gigawatts of cross-seam transmission capability, that's a lot of energy, right? 30 gigawatts, it's greater than the peak load of ISO New England or ISO New York, or New York ISO rather. So I think you can get out of a bind relatively quickly by using the availability of the resources in your neighboring networks. If you can all get onto that network, we've seen this thing hold true for the last 100 years about the value of trading capacity and generation. So I think there's a huge value stream there. When we talk about resiliency at the laboratory, we classify it into about 4 different areas. We have extreme events, which are largely driven by weather. We have attacks, which could be physical or cyber. We have portfolio risk, which is where a policy or economic conditions could result in the evolution of your power system. That's a risky position, right? All one type of resource. And then we have fuel assurance or resource availability, which gets into the natural gas question and wind and solar availability. So we'd really love to deploy these types of capabilities to answer some of those questions to figure out what that benefit is there.
Other questions?
I'm Christy Carter. I'm a PhD student at Iowa State. I'm a meteorologist as well, so I'm going
to
ask a meteorology question. So you
Great.
said you're using 2012 weather data, and you want to extend that for 7 years. Are you going to look at other years that also have extreme events, or just like a range of ideas? Because even the last month alone is kind of breaking all sorts of records. So trying to model 2024 to 2038, I can almost guarantee that what's happening in 2012 and other historical years is not going to be what's going on in the future.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Another smart student that you got there, Jim. And so the reason we chose 2012, so we currently have 7 years of time synchronous load, wind, solar, and hydro data at the laboratory. Okay, 7 consistent years. That's the 7 years that we had satellite data availability, and that's when we had enough cycles on the numerical weather prediction model to run the wind data. We ran WRF for that. And so we chose the year 2012 because it was the most average year of those 7 years. We didn't want to choose an extreme event year because then you have to run the other cases and now your computation runs up. So we chose 2012 as our most average year. We said it was average because the conditions were the most equal across the country. In some of our other weather years, we saw that, we had a really windy year in Texas, or a really windy year, or a really sunny year in other places. Wind availability did change quite a lot through the years. Solar availability did not change that much throughout the years. We saw that was relatively consistent, but the wind could have some big distribution. So let's see. see, we have through 7 to 14 are our years that we have available. We chose 2012 because it was the most average conditions. We're going to go run the other 6 years as part of the North American Renewable Integration Study. And then hopefully, if we figure out how to get enough computer cycles, we'll be able to run some WRF models to start looking at I'll call it weather evolution over the future.
Other questions?
Charlie?
Two questions. The first question is, if you were to put a constraint in the objective function to
Keep talking to me, Charlie.
to limit the curtailment, you have like 15% curtailments in there. Do you think it would reduce the amount of renewables built, or would it build more transmission, or what would it do?
It's tough to say. It's tough to say. I think part of the reason we got so in the capacity expansion model, because we assumed a low capacity credit for the wind and solar resources, we did not get a lot of curtailment in our expansion model. Actually, I think we got close to zero. When we ran the production cost model and you actually see the availability when you have these resources that are pumping out full power for days on end, you actually see more energy than the capacity expansion tool expected. And so that's why we're seeing the curtailment. So we're doing a variety of work to understand curtailment and capacity expansion models over at the laboratory, including a lot of regression analysis to figure out how to apply that. I think if you put a constraint on curtailment in your expansion models, we kind of do that a little bit, and it does drive up more transmission generation, and it does drive up more diversity in your resources, right? Because oftentimes the curtailment is driven by correlations in the resources that you pick. So if it's really windy in SPP and you build all your resources in SPP, you get a lot of curtailment there. But if you can diversify that a little bit, it's not as bad.
Okay, can I ask a second question?
Yes.
The second question was from one of your results slides. I don't know if you can go back and
sure.
show
Which
it again.
One?
Yeah, it's one. It was a cost-benefit slide, and it showed a very high benefit-to-cost ratio for the.
This one.
Let's see. It was the D2B. No,
okay.
It wasn't that one. It was very high benefit-to-cost ratio for D2B compared to D1 and 3. D2B, carbon policy.
So one of the things that drives this is the curtailment. The curtailment in our model was highest in design 3. Believe it or not, we think that there's a couple ways that we could address that concern. One of those ideas is if you got an HVDC terminal that's located in a wind or solar resource area, why don't you just directly connect those plants to the HVDC terminal? That'll decrease your curtailment and increase your benefits quite a bit. So that we think that is driving some of the results is that we see some high curtailment levels. The other thing is that design 2B is not, it's sort of self-contingent, whereas the macrogrid overlay is truly designed to be self-contingent, where you can have a failure in any other line, the system can still maintain itself. So it's not a quite apples to apples comparison in some of these networked layouts. It's just a little bit different. I think that's driving some of the results.
I think it was actually a different slide. It was one where D2B benefit-to-cost ratio was much higher than the next one. And really the question it raised in my mind is, why did the benefit-to-cost ratio go up so much when you increased the capacity, and it was still significantly below the macro grid? So where is the benefit coming from? Did a lot more AC transmission get built in that case?
A lot of AC transmission did get built in Design 2B to make it to those 3 lines and to make it to the back-to-backs that still existed. So there is a lot of AC transmission. The other thing, you're building the very highest capacity factor resources. I mean, you know, the very best Wyoming, Nebraska, and Nevada solar. That's what you're really driving for.
All right, that makes sense.
Mary Ann. Oh,
Got a question here with a mic.
Stephen.
Yeah, one more. So, in the D1 is the business as usual kind of transmission forecast, right?
Sure, yeah, except we still build a lot of interregional AC transmission, so it's not totally business as usual. It's just no new cross-seam transmission.
Exactly. So, you know, obviously, when you went to the D3, which I think is the most robust enhancement of the seams, you saw some decrease in that curtailment that Charlie was just talking about. But when we, it seems likely that maybe the assumptions about the sort of maybe not interconnection level, or maybe the assumptions about what kind of transmission support were needed within the interconnections that already exist. Because even strengthening the seam didn't eliminate all the curtailment, so maybe there's some reinforcement on the individual grids that.
That's right, and we do see some of it here, right? So all this red are all the AC additions that we made, right? These are big AC additions in some cases. Particularly in, I would say, D2A might have the biggest ones, the biggest AC additions. So I think you're right. I think we're seeing some downstream network congestion that's driving a lot of that.
But if I recall correctly, D2A was where we were strengthening back-to-backs, so there was.
This one has, no, yeah, I'm sorry, that one has increasing back-to-backs. This is design one. Sorry, that's what I meant.
Okay.
So, but we still do see significant AC transmission expansions in that case. I mean, it's many gigawatts.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Marianne?
With the Edison Electric Institute. I'm a recovering economist, so I do love economies of scale and scope. And so it seems like we're almost having a little bit of a national renaissance or debate about almost local versus large-scale projects. I kind of liken this to grow local in your local farmers markets. And so out of this study, what data would you use to educate the public on economies of scale and the benefits of transmission, and what additional studies would you like to see done to demonstrate economies of scale?
So I think we absolutely have to do the no transmission case, right? So we have to do that case to really demonstrate some of the scale benefits that we get, the step function improvement. So I think that's one that we need to do. I think we need to look at a couple other designs, that a couple different configurations of design 2A or 2B or 3 to see that value persists. I don't know how to explain the scale to people, right? A lot of people right? Imagine an engineer that they could have their house run off the solar panels on the roof, the battery in their basement, and the EV in their garage. And I think it's really hard to convey to them that your electricity demand is so much more significant and variable than those resources can provide. And that's why you need transmission. And so depending on your goals, whether your goal is increased security or resiliency, or increased use of renewable energy resources, or increasing the local resources that you want to try to build, these different configurations kind of allow you to look at all of those, right? And allow you to extract those values. So if you care about security, I got to wait to pay to get that security. So the cost benefit analysis that you get from economics, and you get the security benefits as a side note, right? Doug, I think you have a question in the back.
Yeah, Doug Arendt, also at NREL with Aaron. So to Charlie's question about curtailment and whether or not that's a constraint or not, I thought it would be important for this crowd in particular to recognize that DOE, NREL, and many of the other national labs are actually looking at the utilization of electricity in other sectors. So in fact, transferring that through electrolysis into hydrogen that might go into a thermal use, or into fuels, or into industrial and commercial units. And so I guess posing that back to you, Aaron, if there were value in that, quote, excess electricity, do you have a sense of what the impact would be on the, quote, value or the results of the SEAMS analysis?
No, yeah, you're right. So to the extent that you can find alternative uses for that energy during that time, the value can go up. Right? There's other questions about what do you do with all that revenue from the carbon tax. That's another place where you could reinvest it in other areas or help to bridge the gap. So a lot of interesting questions on electrolysis to get stored fuels, right, from hydrogen. A lot of things about, what other sectors could switch over to electricity, whether they're industrial or not. And so what this sends is a price signal, right? Curtailment sends you a price signal. It says that there is a lot of available energy that's out there. The price is very low, but I just can't get it to you. And so then that helps people start to think about how they might change their behavior and change their practices. Electrification might help out a lot on these topics. Right, so more megawatts, less carbon. I think Willis, I think he was the last one with a question.
No, Bob Smith here.
Oh, okay. We'll get you one. He's had his hand up patiently. Can we get one last question? Then Bob over there will get you. Okay, great. Go ahead, Bob.
Green light's on. So, well, you can hear me. So, okay. So Aaron, can you give us an idea of the quantity of the capacity increase in the existing ties in cases 2A and 2B?
I thought I have that here on a slide.
I think the base was about 1,300 today, right?
1,300 today.
So I'm
Jim, do you
just
remember what it goes up to for design 2A? I thought I had it on here, but it looks like it fell off that chart somehow. Because it go up to 20 gigawatts of transfer capability between the east and the west?
It's 20 gigawatts to 30 plus, I think, but I can get you that number at 25.
About 25. So we go from 1,200 today to 25 gigawatts in design 2A.
All right, thanks.
Which is a massive increase.
Are we on? Okay. Bill Long, University of Wisconsin, emeritus professor, which if you are Latin scholars means without merit. Now, my background is HVDC. I've been involved in IEEE and Seagray work for a long time. You mentioned the 1968 study that was done in the Pacific Northwest on the spreading the power across the grids up there. It's called the Northwest Power Study. I've been aware of that for a long time. You can actually find reference to it in Kim Bark's HVDC book. That's where I chased it down the other day. At the end of chapter 1, he lists references, and he lists that study. I had contacted the federal agency that does scientific searches for you, and they could not find it. But the librarian at Bonneville Power found 2 references, that particular one, and a second one, which is an analysis of that study. Okay, I've got to get my hands on those. I'm promised to get PDF copies of them. I think 2 books reside in the catacombs there, probably with the mice and the mushrooms. But anyway, I'm going to get copies of those and pass those on to Dale, because Dale used to work for me, and it's the proper thing for him to do rather than me.
Well, I look forward to reading them because I'm a power systems history buff.
Okay, well these are fascinating because these were early studies. My other comment is in the Wall Street Journal of all places, 4 days ago maybe, there was a huge article on offshore wind development in the U.S. And if anybody is interested in where that is going, well, you might chase those down. Chase that down.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For offshore wind, we're seeing a dramatic decrease in the cost for offshore wind and substantial growth happening in the Northeast. We're also talking to a lot of people in California and the Pacific where they say, hey, Aaron, I know Wyoming has great wind, but have you looked at Northern California's offshore wind resource? And they're pretty confident that as they march towards these goals of 80 or 100% renewables in California, that they're going to need to tap into those resources. And I'm going to assume that I think that that's going to increase the value even more of these transmission, because it's going to give greater market access for the offshore resources and greater weather and load diversity than we would get just from these. So thank you. I look forward to hearing about those.
And as other people have questions, sorry we couldn't get to everybody, but as you have questions or think of questions, please send them directly to Aaron or to one of us on the committee, and we'll make sure Aaron gets them, and he'll be more than happy to answer them.
Well, thanks, everyone. I hope you liked it.